Today's topic is going to be about how video games can communicate its messages through either its narrative or through its gameplay mechanics. The reason why I'm talking about that is because thanks to the potential capabilities of video games communicating certain messages through two different means, there are so many people, particularly political activists, that try to exploit this possibility. Take for example this writer.
Video games are political. Here's how they can be progressive. If video games are to be politically revolutionary, we need to reimagine what they could look like.
The Guardian comes in with this piece trying to explain how video games can be progressive and the methods in which those video games communicate this progressive message either through the gameplay or through the narrative. The article tackles both, but we're gonna start off with the simplest one, which is narrative. One of the most interesting things that I learned from this article is how the focus of game developers using narrative communication as their means of spreading their political message has led into the rise of so many unconventional games that have zero gameplay, like walking simulators. There are two main reasons why progressives really love their walking simulators, and it's not just because they find traditional mindless gory fun games really icky. No, seriously. The first reason is to prevent this thing called Ludonarrative Dissonance. A lot of modern video games these days have a story and a gameplay. Unfortunately, the disconnect between the story and the gameplay is something that happens quite often in video games. For example, you're a total badass in the game, but the story depicts you as very weak. It's very common in a lot of video games, and we call this Ludonarrative Dissonance. Now, to prevent that, all you need to do is very simple. You reduce the gameplay to the point where you don't really have any sorts of freedom. You can only sit and stare to the narration or the text messages, which makes the game more akin to visual novels or adventure games, except visual novels have multiple routes and amazing waifus to pick. Walking simulators have nothing much to offer, really. I mean, Gone Home only has one route, and you're not even the lover. The second reason is kind of the first reason as well, but it's more related to the fun aspects of the gameplay. In order for you to communicate your messages through the narrative effectively, the player needs to not have any sorts of fun, because if they do, they would ignore the story. If you have any sorts of fun in a game, you're not gonna care about the story at all. You're just gonna shoot demons or kill the bad guys. In other words, you don't want to be entertained. It will just ruin the mood. And that's why a lot of these progressive games or progressive media in general tend to be really not fun. Their focus is to spread their political messages rather than actually trying to be just good old fun. And video games not being fun is not profitable. To quote Reggie,
"The game is fun. If it's not fun, why bother?"
This is why recently a lot of game developers, particularly Ubisoft, spoke out against wanting their games to be political. I've talked about them twice in my previous videos, so let's talk about them again very briefly, shall we?
In recent weeks, the well-trodden argument that games aren't political has resurfaced, fueled partly by the refusal of the developer of Division 2 to acknowledge the political significance of its forthcoming game, set in a devastated post-pandemic Washington, D.C., kept in order by the military.
That's because if the Division 2 takes any political side, they're only gonna make the game to be more divisive. Here's a little bit of a truth bomb for you, writer. There are a lot more people on the center than they are in the far side of any ideology. If you don't believe me, you can check out how many people identify as a feminist. Spoiler alert, it's not that many. That's why video games now decided to not be political, because they want to appeal to as many audiences as possible and make as much money as possible. Guess what? It is successful, with Far Cry 5 breaking the franchise sales records, so you can still enjoy the game regardless of your political beliefs. Although that being said, if you game developers are gonna take a side, taking a side on the people on the center is a lot more profitable than taking the sides of the people in the extremes. I do find it hilarious that the same people who shout, "Video games should be political," are going to complain when there are political elements in the video game that they don't agree with. A good example for this is the hoopla surrounding Doom Eternal. You know what? I'm just gonna call controversies hooplas just to illustrate how pathetic they are.
Sounds like a lot of...
Hoopla!
It sounds like a lot of...
Hoopla! Hoopla!
Anyway, at one moment in the gameplay trailer for Doom Eternal, here's what the PA had to say. Ooh boy, that has pissed off so many people. And you know what? I think we need more video games that piss off these sorts of people. The number of radicals are very little compared to the sensible ones, and you're not gonna lose too much sales over them. They're not really the sorts of people who buy the games anyway.
On the contrary, like all art that arises from culture, games are deeply political. They are also often biased, even when their designers intend them to be impartial, towards conservative, patriarchal, and imperialist values such as empire, dominion, and conquering by force.
That's because in a lot of video games, in order for you to win, you need to build a big empire, dominate everyone, and conquer everything, which can be done by force or it can be done by diplomacy or technological achievement, depending on your playstyle. I'm just merely describing the rules of civilization, in which the writer acknowledged later on and criticized it for a stupid reason. We'll get to that.
But video games can and should be put to work for left-wing politics at this moment of cultural and political uncertainty. Many games communicate progressive values in their narrative and content, but if they are to go further, we must reimagine what a game could look like.
I love that the writer talks about how video games should push left-wing politics at the moment of cultural and political uncertainty. In other words, if you're not sure about your politics yet, it should absolutely be left-wing and it should absolutely be very, very far to the left. And here's how video games can spread those messages.
Liberal themes in video games, from Detroit's 4,000-page script assessing the dangers of AI to Assassin's Creed's...
I can assure you people that the fear of artificial intelligence, especially being illustrated by Detroit Become Human, is completely freaking overblown. Artificial intelligences right now are always made to cleverly respond to certain pre-programmed conditions that are based on objective measures. Even their self-learning algorithms are made through objective calculations. They're never gonna be as sentient as they were in Detroit or even have feelings because they only respond to objective calculations, and feelings are not objective. It is simply not possible for artificial intelligences to have feelings, and I bet your ass that it's not gonna be possible for the next 20 years. So that's about one of the few social commentaries that Detroit Become Human spectacularly failed at. That said, if the future decided to prove me wrong, I am happy to admit it. It's just that as someone who is in computers and studying AI, I just don't see it happening, and you guys absolutely need to chill.
While some cultural critics point out that games tend to support militarist or conservative values on the vocal right wing of the gamer community, the claim is that games extol left-wing ideology by featuring marginalized characters. In short, any character that is not white, straight, and male.
In some ways, yes, you can see how video games featuring marginalized characters can be seen as extolling left-wing ideology. The reason is because the far left always begged for representation. The most recent one being the Ruby Rose Batwoman controversy. I have a video for that linked down below, which YouTube not only suppressed but also demonetized because reasons. And you know what? That gives me a very good reason to e-beg. Help everyone! I am being demonetized by YouTube! Go and support me on Patreon, link down below, or PayPal too. Nah, just kidding. I'm not here in any sort of crisis. It's Independence Day here after all. But speaking of Patreon, huge thanks to my new patrons, Soma and Gwen, for the pledges. You guys are fantastic. Anyway, back to the topic. In the current political climate that we have right now, if a video game decides to have characters that are part of the minority, people are going to think that it's appealing to the left-wing ideology. People used to think that Far Cry 5 is going to appeal to the far left by having right-wing Christian cultists to be the enemies, but lo and behold, the politics are actually more even-handed and the cultists actually have minorities in them. Even Detroit's politics are not blatantly one-sided, but regardless, people's fear regarding far-left ideologies invading video games thanks to having characters from a minority background is somewhat understandable. Gears of War 5, for example, you have a female protagonist now instead of a male one. People can perceive this as agenda pushing, even though there have been female soldiers in the previous Gears of War games. The current year political climate has warped people's perception into thinking that certain moves being done by certain companies are done to appeal to certain ideologies. In some ways, they are correct, but in a lot of ways, it's also really, really stupid. Unfortunately, that's just the reality of the situation. That's the reality that you guys created. You have turned a lot of people to see things that are actually just mere exaggerations or misunderstandings of the actual content. But that being said, these people's fears are more and more justified the moment you decided to put this article to the public. You know what? Every single time someone begs for video games to be political, I need to show people getting mad at the Doom Eternal trailer.
This liberal influence has failed to turn video games to a force for progressive politics. In short, progressive content is not enough. Wolfenstein might be about killing Nazis, but it gave birth to the first-person shooter genre, in which players often spray bullets in the service of American foreign policy. Civilization and Tropico might allow identification as a socialist state or egalitarian democracy, but they require adherence to the principles of Western capitalist empire building to succeed on gameplay level.
And here we have a glimpse to the writer's view of how video games should be. Here we have just a tiny little glimpse of what an ideal video game looks like to the writer over here. Let's take a look at each and every example. Wolfenstein is about killing Nazis, but it gave birth to the first-person shooter genre, which mostly consists of games like Call of Duty, where you spend more time killing foreigners. Do you see how the writer likes a video game that agrees with his political opinion, but then dislikes a video game that disagrees with him? Civilization and Tropico might allow you to identify as a socialist state or egalitarian democracy, but they require adherence to the principles of Western capitalist empire building to succeed on gameplay level. Writer, are you trying to say that socialism doesn't work? Because it sounds like you're trying to say that socialism doesn't work. Actually, in the case of Civilization, considering that most of the properties and corporations are provided by the government, that doesn't sound like capitalism to me. Then again, telling the AIs of Civilization to build multi-billion-dollar corporations is the sort of move that will obliterate people's CPUs.
Video games communicate ideology at the level of form, and laying a progressive storyline over the top does not necessarily prevent the game from serving right-wing ideas.
That is actually correct. Just because you have a progressive story doesn't mean that you have a progressive gameplay. You also need video games to have a more progressive gameplay so that they can communicate their messages effectively. The problem with that is that games that have a progressive gameplay tend to deviate themselves from the video game tradition of good old fun. To put it simply, they are not fun to play. Why? As we have established previously, so that you are not distracted.
Whilst Marxist Raymond Williams showed, years after the fact, that the form of 19th century novels still supported conservative values, despite containing left-wing content, novels such as those of Charles Dickens might sympathize with workers or with revolution, even lionize them, but they could never instigate serious social change because their political power was limited by the fact that the books were still a commodity to be read after dinner and for pleasure, a kind of storytelling that is easily consumed and doesn't make the readers confront real politics.
So remember when I talked about how in order for you to make progressive games, you have to reduce the gameplay elements to the point where it's almost non-existent and therefore deviating themselves from the traditional means of fun? This is exactly the reason why. People go to video games because they want to have fun with the gameplay. They want to be entertained. The gameplay is the major entertainment value that video games can offer. However, in order for you to spread your propaganda, you need to not have fun, because if you don't have fun in video games, that means that the message is a lot easier to convey. That means that you can't be distracted with how much fun you're having. That means that the only thing you can focus on is the political message. Do you see why progressive games don't really have that much gameplay? Do you see why progressive things in general are not entertaining at all? It's because they're not supposed to be entertaining. We have a writer from The Guardian here talking about how the works of Charles Dickens do provide interesting commentaries and sympathy towards workers, but their main purpose is to entertain and not to provide any sorts of commentary. And especially it's not being made to instigate serious social change. That's incredibly optimistic of you, writer. The writer is disappointed that the book is seen as entertaining stories to enjoy rather than a medium for political messages that will instigate serious social change. Seriously, trust me when I say that between having a political message and having entertainment, you need to have either one or the other. You really cannot have both. Even if you try to have both, you're not gonna have them at their best. You're only gonna have the weaknesses of both rather than harnessing each of their strengths. Being entertaining means you will diminish the message. Being a messenger means you will diminish the entertainment. Honestly, in the video game realms, I have yet to see a good example of video games that communicate its politics through the medium of both narrative and gameplay while still have enough entertainment value to make it fun. My favorite game of all time, Deus Ex, is a game with a lot of political elements, but it doesn't try to send any sorts of message. It just presents you the story, the setting, the characters. All of it was to serve the non-linear and fun gameplay. All of it was for entertainment. Meanwhile, we have Wolfenstein 2, a game that is very blatantly anti-Nazi and very blatantly adopts the far-left anti-Nazi rhetorics on current year, and yet it completely underwhelms in terms of narrative and gameplay. The story was significantly weaker compared to the first, and the gameplay was not only largely unchanged, but also a hell of a lot shorter. It's one of my most disappointing game of last year. I find Sniper Elite 4 to be a much more superior Nazi killing experience. The story was not that great, but at least it offers freedom and catharsis. It doesn't focus too much on being anti-Nazi, and instead just serves you a really fun, tactical stealth experience from start to finish. Let me put it this way, Wolfenstein 2 has Hitler, but you can't kill him. Sniper Elite 4 has Hitler, and you can shoot him in the balls. My point here is focusing too much on having a political message, and especially trying to be on the right side of history, is only going to be a huge detriment to your game. So remember how Battlefield 5 is going to introduce women in World War II, and how historically inaccurate it is, at least to 90% of battlefields in World War II? I talked about this in my previous video, but there's something very interesting you need to check out. An EA executive said that if you don't like that creative decision, then don't buy the game. And sure enough, Battlefield 5 gets significantly lower pre-order demands. And not only that, but the same EA executive Patrick Söderlund also left EA. Now apparently it's caused by Call of Duty and Red Dead Redemption having much higher pre-orders. For Red Dead Redemption, I totally get it, but how can Call of Duty Black Ops 4, a game that is pretty much the same as last time, having much higher pre-orders than Battlefield 5, a World War II game that a lot of people really want from Battlefield? This is an interesting question to answer, right? Call of Duty World War II was so underwhelming last year, I forgot that the game was even released last year. So Battlefield 5 should be the clear winner, and yet it isn't. Ponder on that for a second. If you're gonna make a video game, or perhaps any other entertainment media, merely to get to the right side of history or political virtue signaling, it's not gonna be well received by the audiences. It's impossible to make an entertainment media that has a political message and also be entertaining. You need to have one or the other. Either have political message that nobody wants to see, or a game that is traditionally entertaining and make millions of dollars from it. And here's where the writer talks about the main point. Now in this paragraph, the writer makes the point that a lot of modern novels refuse to be comforting. The novels introduce more elements that are more meta, like unreliable narrators, taking the advantage of the capabilities of the medium and what kind of stories that can be told through it. So it's not just the storyline and characters that have to be progressive. The gameplay also needs to be progressive, and by that I mean the gameplay should not adhere to the traditional concepts of fun. It needs to somehow make a critical commentary on current game mechanics, or perhaps anything in life, and communicates its commentary through the means of gameplay, or perhaps even lack thereof. So this introduces us to another part of the debate: sticking to traditional storytelling and gameplay, or making more progressive storytelling and gameplay. Do you want video games to stick to its traditional roots of fun, or do you want video games to be more progressive, subversive, and take more risks? This is a debate that the writer introduced, and I would really love to know your take in the comments down below. But before we get to it, here's my take on the entire thing. There are a couple of problems with the writer's idea of making games to be more subversive, progressive, and politically woke or something. When the writer talks about books that have more meta elements in them, or books that use the capabilities of its medium to its fullest extent, the writer also talks about how those books will make people to confront the realities of their own politics. Sorry to say this, writer, but thanks to the nature of entertainment media being entertainment media, as we have established previously, a lot of readers are simply going to miss the political narratives or implications that the writers weave in the story. And the reason is simply because a lot of people read fictional books to be entertained, not to be lectured at. The same goes to video games, actually doubly so. As we have established, video games have two different methods of communication. It's either through the story, which is a lot more passive, or through the gameplay, which is a lot more active. Both of these are not effective in spreading your message. If you communicate your politics through the story, then most gamers aren't gonna pay attention because they mostly care about the gameplay. So you reduce the gameplay to the point where it doesn't exist, or you communicate them through the gameplay. But even that one is not going to be effective. The reason is very simple. Gamers play different games all the time. These different games that gamers play will have different rules that the gamers must follow, and they will communicate different means of completing their objectives. Deus Ex, for example, it can reward exploration and taking down the enemies non-lethally. But in Doom, while it does reward exploration, you absolutely have to kill the demons. Sorry, mortally challenged beings. In Euro Truck Simulator, you absolutely need to adhere to the rules of traffic. But if you're in Grand Theft Auto, go absolutely freaking nuts. The point is, thanks to gamers playing so many different games from time to time with different sets of rules, there's absolutely no way that you can communicate your political message and make them stick. Every game has different methods of reaching the victory state. Now, that being said, there are games that do provide commentaries on current gameplay mechanics and still manage to be interesting, engaging, and innovative. The Stanley Parable is, and perhaps the only example, of a game that subverts the typical gameplay formula to provide commentary commentaries on video game narrative. I would love to see more examples from you, writer, in gameplay that is progressive and can communicate someone's political belief effectively. But the writer's example in these progressive and subversive games are not exactly progressive.
At E3, developer Media Molecule described its latest attempt to make the gamer an artist in dreams. While the studio's previous game handed players supervisual involvement in level creation, a feature of games since the 1980s, dreams make the player a creator at every level, from art to music to design.
That's not progressive at all. Modders do that all the time. User-generated content is not new, and it's definitely not progressive. Come on, give us some new ideas.
The Beyond Good and Evil team has revealed a partnership with Hit Record that will allow users to create content for the game and be paid for it, circumventing concerns surrounding Playbor, gamers working for free while it's generating capital for a developer. Both projects imagine a more flexible form of gaming.
So, user-generated content where the users got paid for it. You're just taking already existing ideas and add money to it. That's not progressive.
In the indie sphere Dwarf's Fortress, the user must oversee and manage drunken dwarfs. Other life simulators reduce their subjects to manageable data, but as the writer David Arbach notes, Dwarf Fortress is built on algorithms with too many possibilities, making the dwarfs fundamentally unmanageable. This produces a whole new logic of people management.
Dwarf Fortress is 12 years old now. If you're not familiar with Dwarf Fortress, it's an indie construction management roguelike game where a lot of its content are built thanks to procedurally generated fantasy world. Writer, procedurally generated content is not progressive. Games that are built on algorithms have been a thing for years, even before Dwarf Fortress.
And David O'Reilly's Everything, the player starts as one species exploring the world, but is encouraged to endlessly switch to the perspectives of other subjects and species until the boundary between subject and other, so solid in the majority of games, collapses.
Everything, the video game, is an art game that has one simple point to bring across, and that is that perspective matters a lot. It's an interesting art game that has a nice point to say, with great presentation on bringing the point across, but the entertainment value runs out really fast.
The 2015 game Prison Architect achieves something comparable on a smaller scale by oscillating the gamer between prisoner and prison designer so that the apparent aims of each, keep them in or escape, are broken down and the gamer starts working on their enemy's interests at heart.
In other words, a game where you can pick two completely different roles in two completely different gameplay modes. Writer, this has been a thing for years in so many games. This is also not progressive. The only reason why it's progressive is because you haven't played many video games. Can we have a natural gamer to write this article?
These games, relatively rare at the moment, are formally different experiences which encourage the gamer to think in politically progressive ways.
So, let me get this straight. Your examples are a game with user-generated content, a game with user-generated content where you get paid, a game with procedurally generated content, a game that has one main point with little to no entertainment value, and a game where you can play two completely different and opposing roles. Those examples are relatively rare the same way potatoes in grocery stores are relatively rare. The writer raised a good subject matter to discuss, and yet the writer gave the most abysmal examples.
These games show potential for a gaming canon that, like modernist literature, is progressive in both form and content.
Actually, no, not really. These games did nothing new. They do nothing progressive. The writer just doesn't play too much video games to know about it.
It's not progressive if you're progressing to the place where we already are, genius!
While telling stories about marginalized characters and from liberal perspectives might do some of the work, and commenting on the limitations of existing forms might do some more, gaming is at the kind of crisis point that literature was at the early 20th century. It needs a structural renovation. Without this, video games might sometimes look left-wing, but they cannot be revolutionary.
Writer, you wrote this article to your perspective, right? In that case, your perspective is so narrow, even bacteria couldn't get through.